Our presenter this afternoon is Dr. Bessel Kolk, who has been the director of the Trauma Center here in Boston for 30 years. He's been a leader in the field of trauma since before people were so interested in trauma. He has published widely. I'm sure many of you have read his book on traumatic stress. His most recent book, The Body Keeps Score, has come out. He has
about to come out.
About to come out. Not only has he researched the psychoneurobiology of trauma and been involved in that for a long time, his research has also explored more, you might say, unconventional approaches using yoga, using theater, EMDR, which of course is more conventional these days, but wasn't at one time. So he's not only an outstanding scientist and scholar, but an innovator, a creative thinker, and a healer. So thank you for being with us. Right, and also part of BU. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Since BU may as well. What a great location, by the way. Yeah, I'm a clinician scientist, so I'm not a theologian. In fact, I'm leery about theology. In that so much violence is done in the name of religion, even today in Mosul and everywhere around the world. So it's not really one of my favorite things. Contemplation, stillness, that's a different story. In that regard, how many people in this room practice yoga? Ah, nice big crowd. How many people sing in choirs and stuff like that? Good. How many people make other sorts of music? Good. See, that's the beginning, huh? Because to deal with trauma, you have to move your body. You have to move your body in unison with other people. So seeing such a large crowd of people do that is very helpful, encouraging to me. And of course, that's been one of the tasks of religion since time immemorial, that when people are bereft and miserable, is to get them to move and to make movements that help them to regulate your body. And some of the things that I'll talk about, heart rate variability training and stuff like that, is common to all religions. Davening, moving, bending back and forth, activates the bodily systems that you need to reestablish a sense of ownership over your body. So this is a slide that I like to start with. It is a picture by a countryman of mine. I never got to meet him because he'd been dead 300 years by the time I was born, 400 years. Peter Bergel. It's a trauma picture. And it's a trauma picture about an adolescent. And this adolescent, his name was Icarus, was like every other adolescent. He wanted to spread his wings. And there not being any Harley Davidsons or methamphetamines lying around, he decided to shoot birds and to fly. And his mom said, don't do that, be careful. And as happens sometimes with wild adolescents, he plunged into the ocean. And aside from this painting, my favorite commentary on this is by the poet W.H. Auden, who saw this picture in the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Brussels in 1939, and said, about suffering, the ancients were never wrong. How it just passes by. The plowman saw an amazing thing. He saw a boy plunging from the sky, but there's a beautiful spring, and he went on, calming. People love to do that in academic circles. They just keep yakking, talking. This amazing, beautiful ship saw this boy plunging in the ocean, but had important things to do, so it sailed calmly on. And so many people like to talk about trauma. Our newspapers love it, CNN loves it, Fox News adores it. And the more trauma, the better, except the next day, people get forgotten. And then it takes a long time, and then sometimes people they get courage after a year or 2 or 30 to knock on the door of people like me and say, I am desperate. Can you help me? So I think trauma has become very inflated concept. Everything is called trauma these days. And we just like to show you what trauma looks like. Trauma is an event that overwhelms mind and brain and destroys who you are. It's not like a bad thing. It's not like getting a bad grade, missing your MBTA, not your car falling down. No, it's about you will never be the same again. This is it. Bad stuff. And so the earliest movies that I've been able to get a hold of what trauma looks like is from the time that to me is sort of the ultimate tribute about what an insane species we are, the First World War. The First World War, to my mind, is sort of the epitome of how it sort of looks bad for us as human beings. Because usually we like to kill other people for an excuse, because they have slaves, or because they're Shiites, or some religious stuff. But in the First World War, people had the same religion, same blue eyes, same economy, and they just went at it. And 4 years and 50 million people later, they said, what the fuck did we do? But not very long, because 18 years later, the next war broke out. Yeah. So we are a very crazy species. And so technology allows us to see what it looks like. So this is the earliest movies about shell-shocked soldiers. And what you see here is this is not a mental event. This is not a psychological event. These are bodies that are stuck in trauma. And people's bodies are stuck in trauma. Once you get traumatized, your body is different. Your talk is different also, your mind is different. But that's not the biggest thing, is you're filled up with impulses, sensations, feelings in your body that make you do things that you have no control over. Usually things that have to do with the trauma, where you usually suddenly lash out, or this guy is told the word bomb, and he hears the word bomb, he jumps under the bed. And the next guy sees a red hat, and the red hat makes him go, and he makes go crazy. And so it's about bodies that go crazy. I was trained in psychoanalysis, and I was trained as a verbal psychotherapist. And I love the power of language, and I love the power of people being able to tell their truth, being able to speak about what happened to you and finding resonance is one of the glories of being a human being, the purpose of psychotherapy, and it can be make an enormous change in people's minds and brains. Sadly, what my and other people's research showed is that talking about terrible things doesn't quite make it go away. And so I was in this awkward position of having written 2 books about traumatic stress and being considered one of the world's experts in traumatic stress back in 1994. But there was a little thing missing there, is I had no treatment chapters. You can be a great expert in something without having a treatment chapter. It's great. Because I didn't know how to treat it. Because I was trained as a verbal psychotherapist, and I could talk stories, and I could be empathic with my patients. And fundamentally, it didn't change. And then some people in my clinic started to do something really weird. They started to wiggle their fingers in front of people's eyes while people were remembering their trauma. And they were very enthusiastic about it. And I'm a young Harvard professor at the time, and I tell people, stop that immediately. We are a respectable group of people, and we're not do things like wiggling our fingers in front of people's eyes and stuff like that. They did it anyway. And they happened to be some of the most talented people I had working for me, for smart and wonderful people. And at some point, they sent somebody to convert me, because it's all about religion. And they sent Steve Lazaroff to show me a movie. And I reluctantly watched his movie. And anybody who's ever heard me speak has seen this movie because I show this movie all the time. This is my Paul on the way to Damascus movie. Because this little few seconds captures the problem with treating traumatic stress. Namely, at the moment that people evoke it in their mind, they start going crazy. Their bodies start going out of control. And maybe you haven't seen it, so let me play it again. And so the moment that she calls it up into her mind, her shoulders go up, her breathing becomes tense, her butt sort of lifts halfway out of the chair, as she becomes like a frightened creature. And that's the problem with treating traumatic stress, is that the moment you go there, people become the traumatized people. And nobody really wants to go there. So everybody you know who's been traumatized, including you don't really want to talk about what happened. Because the moment you talk about it, you start freaking out and start feeling like it's happening again. And so, as therapists, we see these reactions in our patients, and seeing how distressed people become, we steer away from it. Because most therapists are not sadistic people, and they don't want people to really freak out. And so we talk about our childhoods and their mothers and about their terrible boyfriends and their schoolwork, and we talk about everything except the trauma, because we don't know how to deal with that. It's too much. And how bad it is nicely illustrated here.
I was in red light on Cherry Street. I was in the left.
For those of you who are sort of body-oriented people, do you see her feet go up and down as if she's hitting a brake? The body relives this stuff.
Yeah. I thought she was going to come to my windshield and then I was going to die. She?
So it's hard to think that doing this with the patients would be very helpful for them. It's very clear that she becomes more and more agitated. And so most of us sort of verbal psychotherapists shy away from torturing our patients in this particular way. There's a treatment method that's widely promulgated through the VA these days, much to my horror, something called prolonged exposure treatment, where you expose people to their trauma like this over and over again. And indeed, in about half of the cases who get it, those who do not commit suicide or turn to drugs to deal with the overwhelming emotions, about half of them have about a 10% improvement in their PTSD. When a researcher has a 10% improvement, they say, wow, that's so great. We are statistically on the right track. 10% improvement is not good enough. And what exposure treatment does to people is nicely illustrated by, as I was writing my chapter about this stuff for my book last year, I went for a walk, and I saw a little 5-year-old kid on a tricycle whose dad was screaming at this kid. And I was freaked out seeing this huge guy brutalizing this kid. And much to amazement, this kid just riding his tricycle and was not upset by his dad at all. And I thought to myself, good, this kid has been desensitized to his father's brutality. Or as we call it in the attachment world, he is dealing without feeling. He has learned to cut off his emotions. You don't really want to hang out with people who have that particular way of coping with the world, who have learned to deal but not feel. I think people who run universities and people who run insurance companies may sometimes be people like that. But you really want to be with people who have a feeling of pain and hurt and sorrow and joy, and for whom all of that has not been cut off. So desensitization is obviously not the treatment for traumatic stress. And so here's another thing. As human beings, we tend to look for things that confirms how we look at the world. And we sort of continuously just push out stuff that doesn't fit with our preconception. And so therapists are very much into people's minds. And they are not much into bodies and organisms. But I'd like to invite you to just imitate the way that this person sits for a second. So she has her chair, her butt slightly lifted out of her chair. Her shoulders are sort of up like this. Now sit like this. And now say, boy, I really love being here today. That's how our patients sit. And as long as you sit like this, you're not capable of feeling joy, pleasure, openness to other people. And this whole dimension of the body determining what our mind can do is basically non-existent in therapy. And when you actually talk about it, you say, oh, he's this alternative person. Really? I'm just looking. Okay. So I'm irritated with Steve with wasting my time. And then he shows the next clip. The next clip is the same person after 2 sessions of his particular treatment. And this is before I do meditation, before I'm a body worker, before I do yoga. And yet, it's obvious that this person has gone through a dramatic change. And again, I would like to invite you to sit like this lady sits. Let me just demonstrate. Her hands are in her lap. She shows us her sternocleidomastoid muscle. It's the muscle of curiosity. And her shoulders are down and back. So can I just see that? See your shoulders go down and back? Lift your neck a little bit. And now say, I hate Dick Cheney. Even I can't hate Dick Cheney when I sit like that. Okay? Because when you hold your body in a certain position, you cannot do the hating thing. You cannot do the worry thing. And what's fascinating to me is how in our world of Western medicine, psychology, social work, and even religion, this is not a familiar posture. After my last visit to the Louvre last year, I decided not to go to the Louvre anymore. I am sick of guys with plumes on horses, strutting along. And I'm much more sympathetic to Southeast Asian art, where people sit like that. It's not part of our traditions, also not very much part of our religious traditions. It's there. A few people sit out and they meditate. As it turns out, that this particular position is just about the only position through which you can change your brain. Which is sort of important if you are a traumatized person. Because unless you get into a deeply interoceptive mode, where you contemplate your internal experience, you cannot change your internal experience. So you can keep putting it out there and talk politics and talk about all these horrible people, but if you really want to change the way you feel, the way you organize your internal reality, you have to go inside. That means that you have to shut up. So, what has Steve done? Steve done this weird thing that I didn't get to research. It's mentioned here. Actually, he says, no, EMDR is respectable. You know why it's respectable? Because I did the research. And so we went to NIMH, did the EMDR research, and what we showed actually is that EMDR turns out up to now the best treatment for a simple, relatively uncomplicated trauma like an assault or a rape. We had an 80% cure rate, which nobody's ever come close to. What's interesting, right now there is a study being done that seems to be, it's going to have probably similar outcomes as we had with EMDR. It comes from a different corner. It is MNDA research. It is research on ecstasy. That's not how most respectable people think about the world. I hear about this research and I say, yeah, makes perfect sense. I get to know the people, very good people. What do? They give people a drug that makes their brains very calm, open, and loving. And as they take those drugs, they start revisiting that wounded self. And they say, oh my God, that's me. Back then, I was beaten up, I was raped, and they develop compassion for themselves as it happened to them. That's very similar to what we do in EMDR and other things. You help people to be in a mindful, safe place where they can observe without getting hijacked what happened to them. And if you do that, you can integrate the experience and say, this happened to me a long time ago. It sucked, but it's over. Doesn't happen anymore. So those are the two treatments that I know for sure. Well, actually, I know one for sure, EMDR, and the other one looks very promising. That can have very profound capacities to help people to integrate the trauma. My hunch is that any treatment that can help people to feel deeply calm and self-observant can have those effects. The problem is that it's very hard to make people feel that calm and to safely observe themselves, because traumatized people are scared to death about what's going on inside. Because there's a misunderstanding that most of us start with. It took me years to figure out it was a misunderstanding. That people think that trauma is something that happens out there. It's a story of when you were little, or when you were in a concentration camp, or when you were raped, or when you were beaten. No, that is a story about something that happened a long time ago. The trauma is the wound that's inside of you. It's the fact that you continue to feel as if you're being raped. That you continue to feel as if right now you're being assaulted. The feeling that right now that you're in danger. So the issue with trauma is that you live in a body that is filled with the residues of the horror of the past. And in order to overcome the horror of the past, you have to cleanse your body. You have to free up your body and learn to own your body. So this is my first foray into that.
And what I want to do is, the last time they were kind of at the end.
And being a body-oriented person, I'm immediately intrigued with that little muscle here. There's a muscle I look for in you guys. I'm curious who of you, and I have a very good eye for that, is curious about what I say, nod your head a little bit from time to time, is physically engaged with what I'm saying, and who sits back like my traumatized patients, like, you're trying to sell me a bill of goods. Because traumatized people always sit like this, like, don't you mess with me. Don't you even try to teach me anything new, because I know the world is a dangerous person, and you probably could hurt me too. So this attitude is what we see in our office most of the time. And the moment that my patients go like this, I go like, yeah, something has happened. It's all in the body. So I see this open person, and I'm surprised, because all he did is wiggle his fingers in front of people's eyes while they were remembering the trauma. They weren't even talking about it. And being a neuroscientist, I have some idea what happens there. We're actually doing a study right now to show that it has to do with the lateral eye fields of the frontal lobe, and it's connected with this 40 megahertz thalamocortical rhythms in the brain, but you don't want to hear about that.
And things today. Can you describe what happened that day for me?
Yeah, I was going up to a traffic light, turned yellow, and
So, if as a clinician you know how to get your patients in 2 sessions from there to there, don't learn anything new. But if you don't, is it really ethical to continue to charge your patients? So what's trauma? For me, September 9/11 was a momentous moment, because trauma came home. I had been working with trauma all over the world, but now it came here. And I was very curious about my own reaction and the reactions of people all around us and of our nation. My own reaction was very similar to George Bush's reaction. Remember, Fahrenheit 9/11? He was reading My Pet Goat upside down to a kindergarten class, and he was whispered in his ear, America is under attack, and he sat there dumbfounded for 18 minutes. I was also dumbfounded for 18 minutes. I thought, there's a little bit of George Bush in me also, which is always a good thing to realize. And so this issue of being dumbfounded was useful because when you're overwhelmed, your mind goes offline and you don't feel anything. And then I was very intrigued with my response to Rudy Giuliani, who before that was not one of my favorite human beings since that time also, but that day he was fantastic. Because I was all befuddled and muddled and didn't know what's happening, and this guy was striding through the rubble and saying, this is happening, that's what's going on. And he gave me some cognition to help me to begin to make sense out of this vast morass of unknowing. So it's very helpful when you're really bereft to have somebody take over for you and say, I know what to do. So that was helpful. And then we saw all these pictures. And again, when I show these pictures to therapists, and they say, what do you see here? They say, I see panicked people. I say, maybe. I see terrified people. I don't. What do you see? You see people who are running. But as most of us who jump over that in order to go into our ideology of the world. But so the first thing we do when we get traumatized is to run, is to flee and to flight, and our bodies do something. And if our bodies do something that works, we don't get traumatized. So it's a physical response, and this response is about the body organizing itself. And then, because I've written all these books that make you an immediate expert on the subject, whether what is in the book is true or not, doesn't matter, I get invited to a whole bunch of so-called expert panels. And I still have a very fresh memory, because in August 2011, I had started to explore my book that is now finished, The Body Keeps the Score, and I'd started to really explore the issues of the body very seriously. In August 2011, I took a course on improv. Anybody here has ever done improv? I can't recommend it highly enough. It's great. It's fun. It's fantastic. So I take this improv course, and we're messing with each other and moving, and at some point we're rolling over each other, and at some point some fairly heavy-set woman is lying draped across me, turns around and says, isn't this great? I used to be a patient in and out of McLean Hospital, but ever since I've been doing these improv exercises, I'm off my medications and I'm doing fine. And I say, that's sort of great, but you're getting a little heavy for me. Could you please get off me? But I remember that beaming face as she is telling me about the glories of improv as I'm sitting on my expert panel, advising the nation about what the best treatments are. And I say to my colleagues, you know, we shouldn't pretend like we know more than we do. Maybe we should let anybody who has a good plan, can describe their method, is able to do outcome measures, to come and do their stuff and pay them for it. But pay them not till 6 months later, till they collect the outcome data, because this is a glorious time to learn about something that works. So I'm on 3 different panels, and all 3 of them I got totally outvoted. In fact, I'm the only person who says that. And at the end, there are 2 treatments that are being recommended, one of which is psychoanalysis. No laughter. Why psychoanalysis? Because aside from the Daniel Center, Manhattan is the last bastion of Freudian psychoanalysis. And this is a political issue. And when you intervene in a particular community, you can not offend the local religion or orientation of the local community. Makes perfect sense. The other thing that gets recommended is CBT. Do we have evidence for CBT under those conditions? No, not really. But every academic believes in these little manuals where you turn a page, you do that, because that's science. And so you cannot offend them either. So those are the 2 things that are being recommended. And it turns out that these people are waiting for all the victims of 9/11 to come to the psychoanalysts and the CBT people, and nobody shows up. And so a colleague of mine, Spencer Eth, who used to run the psychiatry department at St. Vincent's, right about the World Trade Center, does a survey of 225 patients at St. Vincent's who escaped from the World Trade Center that day. And he says, what was most helpful to you to overcome what happened that day? What people say, number one, was acupuncture. Nobody knows what acupuncture does, how it works, whether it's helpful for PTSD, but these stupid New Yorkers say that EMDR is, that acupuncture is useful for them. Well, we're the experts, so we can tell them that they're wrong. Second piece was massages. I can get into that. That's third thing was yoga. Bizarre, twisting yourself into a pretzel, standing on one foot, like treatment for PTSD. These people are crazy. Number 4, EMDR. Those were the 4 things that New Yorkers said was helpful. Totally different from what us experts had recommended. So that was interesting. And then in one of these panels, one of my colleagues, Sandra Galea, shows this particular picture. And I love this picture. I say, can I have your picture? That's so great. Because this is the Brooklyn Bridge, of course. And these people who were running here are running in certain directions. And these people who are running over the Brooklyn Bridge undoubtedly do not live in New Jersey or in Westchester County. So now the basic physiology of trauma becomes clearer. When people are terribly overwhelmed, they start running, and they start running in a particular direction. They have a GPS, and the direction is for home. And what we know from every piece of research ever done anywhere on the subject is that if you can run home, and when you come home, people say, oh my God, let me take care of you. What happened to you? You can talk as much as you want to about it. I'll take care of you. You don't have to go to work. I'll just wash you up, feed you. Those people do just fine. And as a result, in New York, where the response was fantastic, there was virtually no PTSD in response to 9/11. What it also reminded me is that when I started the trauma center 30 years ago, is that I thought we'd get a bunch of refugees and domestic violence and rapes and car accidents and stuff like that. And we basically became a domestic violence clinic, because the people who are most hurt and the hardest to treat are the people who are getting traumatized at home. And the issue of trauma at home is really the big issue. It's the big public health issue. In fact, it's the biggest public health issue in America. It's more expensive than heart disease or cancer. The consequences of children getting abused and spouses getting molested and hurt has more long-term consequences than any medical disease. So that's sort of a big deal. That's sort of what my book is about. But what I loved, people say, this is written like a novel, so it's a very nicely written. So, so as this is all going on, I have a flashback to the last page of my anatomy textbook in medical school. I don't think too many people have flashbacks like that, but I did. And here's that last page of my anatomy textbook, and I say, he nailed it, Frank Netter, because this is what happens when people get traumatized. Their frontal lobe shuts down. Now, this is something that most people, although maybe you're such a holy crowd that it doesn't happen to you, but does anybody in this room, have you ever said mean, horrible, nasty, and totally irresponsibly bad things to people you love? Anybody? Me, okay? A few other people. Because that's what happens to people when their frontal lobe shuts down. You didn't say this from your conscious brain, from your nice brain, from your civilized brain. This came from somebody else, somewhere else. Because when you get really freaked out, that part of your brain disappears. That's a piece of research we did, and since lots of other people since that time. And another part of your brain gets activated. It's your limbic system. and you start secreting stress hormones, and you activate Wernicke's area instead of Broca's area. Wernicke's area stores 4-letter words and not whole sentences. You start moving and hitting, and your heart goes up and down, and your breathing becomes shallow, and your muscles start moving. So that's that part of the brain. And so it's important to know that trauma lives in that side of the brain. It lives in that animal brain. And basically, the people who can teach us about traumatic stress are two groups of people. One is veterinarians, because they deal with very rabid and upset animals, and the other ones are kindergarten teachers who work with people who have hardly any brain. Because once you have a brain, that sort of obscures the reality of trauma, and you start telling stories that usually have nothing to do with what's really going on. So this is what happens in my mind when people are traumatized. It's a somewhat minority point of view, but it also is the view of Pierre Janet in the first great book that he wrote about trauma in 1889, and certainly the view of Sigmund Freud when he wrote his great papers about trauma in 1893 and 1894. Namely, when people get traumatized, this system gets activated, and the body starts going into fight, flight, freeze mode, and once the trauma is over, and you come home and somebody says, I'll take care of you, that situation comes to an end, and you regain your senses. If you have PTSD, this system keeps getting activated over and over again, and you become a nut. You behave like a nut, like the guy in the supermarket, and you do things that are hurtful to other people and humiliating to yourself. Because the animal part of your brain that's in charge of survival interprets things that are really not a danger to you, as if you're in great danger. So the great task of therapy is to do limbic system therapy, to calm that animal brain down. And again, I think probably kindergarten teachers have more to teach us about it than anybody else. So we calm ourselves down by touch, by communal singing. One of my great lessons in trauma therapy came about 1995. I was involved in the Truth Commission in South Africa. And that's a fascinating story, what happened there. Namely, when after Mandela was released from prison, it was inevitable the ANC would take over. Mandela and Tutu and Alex Borain and some other people had long discussions about what they could do to prevent their nation being conceived in bloodshed. Because 1 million people who carry my DNA had been brutalizing 40 million people who were black in South Africa. And the Truth Commission was a fascinating commission because people like to think about it as something that was done to do the black people in South Africa a favor. That's not at all what it was. It was to keep the white people from getting killed. And there was some reason to do that because South Africans knew history and knew that if their nation got conceived in bloodshed the way that India was, people would be paying the price for that for many generations to come, as India and Pakistan are doing today. And so they know that. And so they said, we have to prevent a bloodbath. And in order to prevent a bloodbath, we have to do trauma therapy. And Bishop Tutu was in charge of doing the trauma therapy. He did not get a social work degree, but boy, did he know how to do trauma therapy. And I followed him around. And he would come to these little townships filled with people whose relatives had been killed and disappeared and tortured, etc., very traumatized communities. And he would come to these town halls, about the size of this, and he would get together and he would start with prayer. And then they would start with singing. And being South African, they would do a little dancing. And after a while, he felt really cool. He felt really looked after by Bishop Tutu. That's beautiful. And then people would sit down. And Tutu would invite a family to come and testify about what happened to them. And they started to talk. And before too long, the trauma came back, and they started to wail and cry and become enraged. And Tutu would be with them, and he'd say, "This is too much for any of us to bear. Let's hold each other, let's sing, let's move, and let's dance." And so these hearings went back and forth between moving, dancing, and singing, and telling the truth. And my friend Peter Levine, who wrote this wonderful book, The Tiger, something, took also this pendulation. You build up people's minds, build up people's capacity to tolerate things, and then you bite off a little bit of the trauma. And you pull people back, and you bite off a little bit of the trauma. You go sort of back and forth, and just integrate a little bit at a time. But the focus is always, we build ourselves up in order to deal with that horrible stuff. And as you know, there was no bloodbath in South Africa. And also, most black people did very poorly. At my last visit in South Africa, I was invited by a group of Boers, Afrikaners. My first evening there, the conversation was about how they had been screwed by the Truth Commission. And boy, I needed to use all of my affect regulation capacities to sit at that dinner table. Anyway, so this is how not to treat trauma. What you see here is 8 people who are on a C-3 transport plane, courtesy of the US government, being ferried out of New Orleans. These people have just lost their homes, they have lost relatives, and they're like these people here, they're filled with stress hormones because we are an extremely resilient species, and our hormonal system and our bodies are geared to deal with unspeakable horror and brutality. And in Boston, we get a small taste of that every year. We had a very good taste of it this year because we had another miserable, miserable winter. And there were many times that we walked out of our houses and we saw our damned car once again covered with snow, and you say, why the hell didn't I move to Florida? You're angry, and all the stress hormones start coming out of you, and these stress hormones give you the gumption to get out your shovel and to shovel out your car. That's what you have stress hormones for. They're good, and those stress hormones have made us the dominant species in the universe. We have wiped out just about every other species. You think about it, the moral consequence, but I don't do that. But so you're filled with stress hormones. The worst you can do is to prevent people from using their stress hormones, as the administration at this point, of course, did. And so here are guys who are filled with stress hormones that are there to help them to go to Home Depot, stay up all night, put roofs on their houses. Instead, they get tied down. And being tied down while you're filled with stress hormones is one of the worst human experiences you can have, and a predictor for trauma. My ultimate model of traumatic stress, something I study from time to time, is something called awareness during anesthesia. Waking up in the middle of a surgical procedure when your anesthesia is worn off, but your muscle relax hasn't worn off. Hope it hasn't happened to anybody in this room. Happens to 30,000 Americans a year. It is about the worst trauma I've ever seen. It's very bad. Being tied down, being conscious, and being filled with a need to escape and to scream, and you can't do it. That's sort of trauma. So here these guys, tied up, unable to do anything, being shipped off to Houston or Cape Cod or Utah, and being told, don't worry about it. Halliburton, our buddies, that doesn't pay taxes but is located in Dubai, and is no longer a US company, will take care of all this stuff and all the money, but you cannot do anything yourself. That is really not a good way of dealing with trauma. And what's interesting also is that, we have science, so we do these studies. And after New York, there was less than 5% incidence of PTSD. In New Orleans, 33% 2 years after Hurricane Katrina. That's what the price you pay for being stupid and oppressive. So here's my poster child, now a pimply, gangly, and dour adolescent, but not then a cute little kid. No, his name is Noam Saul, who, as a 5-year-old, had just started to go to school at PS 234, the school that looks at the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. And on the morning of September 11th, Noam's father, Jack, walks up to school, and I'm just watching my time, drops him off 8:45, he goes to his classroom. 7 minutes later, the planes hit, fire bombs come through the classroom, sounds, pandemonium. He runs downstairs, his dad comes pick him up. They run through the streets. There's 50,000 people who run through the streets of Manhattan. They stay with a friend because their own house was too close. Their day was cordoned off. And on the morning of September 12th at 9 a.m., Noam draws this picture. 2 weeks later, I am in New York to have some stuff, do some stuff around 9/11, and he shows me his picture, and I said, "That's an amazing picture. Can I have it?" He says, "I'll sell it to you for $100." And I say, "Done." So that picture is in my new book. So here's his picture. And I asked Noam, "So Noam, what you see?" "Well, I saw a plane flying the World Trade Center, a lot of smoke and fire. I saw people jumping out. I saw firefighters. What is this? Telephone cells. The telephones no longer were working." And I say, "What's that?" He says, "That is, when the plane hit, it was this fireball. And that fireball came through the window of the classroom. And I thought we were going to burn up. And I still feel the heat of that fireball." And I think, yeah, that's how people remember trauma. People remember trauma not as a story, but they remember the smell of the rapist. The people who I've treated who were in the World Trade Center, escaping over these long staircases, all talk about the horrendous sounds of that building coming apart. So it's the images, the sounds, the body sensations that really hold the trauma. So that makes perfect sense. And then I say, "So what is this over here?" He says, "Oh, that's a trampoline." I say, "Trampoline?" He says, "Yeah, so that when people jump out of the World Trade Center, they'll be okay." I go, wow. He was a 5-year-old kid who did what 92% of Americans couldn't do, and certainly our president couldn't do, because I am eagerly awaiting how our president will respond to this event of 9/11. And he's disappeared for 2 days. Nobody knows where he is. We're a rudderless nation for 2 days. But thank God he comes back after 2 days. And his opening statement is, "We'll kill them dead or alive." And I go, oh my God. We have a limbic man at the helm of the free world. And this is going to be bad. And we killed 200,000 Iraqis. It has nothing to do with the World Trade Center. And that blood is on our hands. And we better do something about it, because this is very bad. Not good to be limbic. Huh? And so that's a big issue. And so the issue with trauma is that you have these limbic reactions all the time. Somebody hasn't done the dishes. Somebody makes noise. Somebody does something. And you become a limbic system person. And you blow up, and you brutalize people, and you shut down, and you become terrified, and you don't go out anymore. And so the question is, how can you open up traumatized people to feel safe in their bodies and to see other possibilities? And so that when you hear a certain sound, you say, oh, that may be a car backfiring, it may be a gun going off, it may be something, but don't to jump to the conclusion that somebody is getting killed. And when somebody touches you on your shoulder, you don't say, oh my God, I'm getting raped, but you can say, maybe somebody is happy to see me, maybe some old geezer is falling over and needs a little support, maybe he's trying to rape me. Let me find out. So it's all about opening up the capacity for imagination. So your brain can learn to reinterpret things again. And when you understand to manage stress, then the things that I'm trying to teach people is not so weird at all. Then doing yoga makes perfect sense. Because when you're a traumatized person, a lot of sensations in your body are terrifying sensations. And you don't want to have any feelings in your body. And so what yoga can do is to open yourself up to yourself and to make it safe to lie on the ground and to breathe, which is not for them. So you feel it safe to do a pelvic hip opener, which is terrifying if you have been traumatized. And to learn to breathe and not have your body go into panic all the time. If the issue is a lack of imagination, then maybe the theater programs that I'm such a fan of do make perfect sense. That a program like what the Shakespeare and Company is doing in the Berkshires, where juvenile delinquents have a choice between being condemned to prison or to become a Shakespearean actor, does make very good sense. Because when you're a frightened, angry, terrified, fucked up kid, and you need to play a role of being Brutus in Julius Caesar, or being Othello, you get to feel, oh, that is what it feels like to be a powerful person. That is what it feels like to be a knave, and to own the words and the language and the bodily attitudes and positions of being something other than that frightened, abandoned, terrified, traumatized, angry little kid that you've grown up to be. To my mind, theater is sort of one of the kings of trauma therapy. But in order to really appreciate it, you have to know something about the brain. And this is our brain. And if you introduce yourself and you say to me, "Hi, my name is Jennifer," I think to myself, very nice. The name of this little part of her brain over here is called Jennifer. It has language, and it has stories to tell, and it has a history, has ideas, has all kind of interesting things to offer. The rest of her brain, she has no control over. Whether she likes me or not, it just happens. You don't decide whether you like somebody. Whether she gets hungry or not, it's not up to you. Whether certain things piss her off, it's not up to her, it just happens. Whether she's able to sleep tonight or not, it's not up to her, it just happens. Whether things frighten her, not up to her, because all these things are located in this part of the brain. And this part of the brain is shaped by experience, it's determined by experience, it's much more profoundly determined by experience than by genetics. If you ever want me to come give a talk about it, I'd be happy to. Because all the research funding these days goes into genetics. I liked the last talk about racism. You know, it's a much deeper scientific issue. All of our scientific money goes into genetics. Why does it go into genetics? Because we don't want to change how people raise their kids, our school systems, and our social conditions. Because when we really countenance how our social conditions are totally messing up millions of people and make them mentally ill, that means that we have to change something. So it's so much more fun to study genetics. Nice laboratories, little rats, pets, nice graduate students. Boy, so fun. It won't do any of us any good, but it's good for if you run a laboratory. I know, because I also run a laboratory. So I know that life. So trauma sits here. And it sits in this limbic system and your frontal lobe. And it sits in how you interpret things. I'm missing something. I'm good. This is the one I wanted to show. Hold on a second. So essentially, our brain sort of contains layers. And the layer that we come into the world with is our reptilian brain. When you have a little baby, go see babies. It's always great to see where you come from. The babies are still alive, and the same organization is still running the show part of the time. And what can babies do? They can be awake, they can be asleep, they can eat, they can poop, they can pee, they can breathe, they can smile, they can suck. that's about it. And we are programmed to find that cute. It's great. And then we move beyond it as fast as we can. But when you get traumatized, that's the stuff that gets messed up. But we want to stay in people's heads and talk about meaning and larger moral issues. No, if you can't sleep, and you don't poop for 7 days, and you can't sleep, and you can't take care of the basic housekeeping of your body, you're nowhere. If you treat trauma, you've got to start in the basement. I don't know any psychology program, aside from us to some degree, that really teaches people how to take care of self-regulation issues in the basement of the brain, which is where the core of trauma resides. I didn't learn about it until I got invited to be at this weird yoga center in the western Massachusetts, the Kupalo, and I started to learn about yoga. I said, oh, these yogis, they have been paying attention to self-regulation for 5,000 years. It's interesting to call that alternative, because these people are really very good at showing some of the basic things you need to do in order to gain ownership of that crazy stuff that's sitting inside of you. So that's good. Next part of your brain is the limbic system. So that's the part of your brain that isn't active when you come into the world, and now gets shaped by experience. The brain is a use-dependent organ. And this part of your brain determines for you what feels safe, what feels dangerous, what is frightening, who you belong to, what you love, what's disgusting, and that's on the basis of experience. And so if you're a child who grows up being accustomed to walk into a room and the world smiles at you, you don't say to yourself, these people are sort of little lovey-dovey, overly Italian type people. I'm just a regular kid. There's 2 billion kids in the world and there's nothing special about me. No, when everybody smiles at you and loves you, you say, I'm great. And when you're 4 years old and your mom screams at you and said, look, you have done to me, you have made a drug addict out of me, I was perfectly fine until you were born, but because you're such a terrible child, I have become an alcoholic and my life is in ruins. That becomes your limbic system. And your limbic system says, I'm a terrible person who makes terrible things happen. Unfortunately, there are almost no pathways for your frontal lobe to your limbic system. And we know this from, as therapists, that our patients with childhood trauma all say, I'm a terrible person. I'm no good. I'm a piece of crap. And nice people like us start off saying, oh, you're wonderful. Look, let's do some cognitive treatment on you. Look what you did. You passed your course, you cooked a good meal, you cleaned yourself, you paid your rent, you're fantastic. And they say, but I had sex with my dad when I was 4 years old. And you say, that wasn't your fault, you were a little girl. You're meant to love people, and your dad took advantage of that, and that was his fault. And your patient will say, oh, thank you, that was so helpful. And nothing changes. And so when you do this work for a while, and you say that sort of bullshit to people for a while, sometimes patients call you on that. And so at one point, I have a patient, her name is Kathy, and I once again tell her, it wasn't your fault. And she says, Bessel, I know how important it is for you to really be a good therapist. And so whenever you say these things, I say, thank you. You have to know, you know that about me. I was raised to take care of narcissistically vulnerable people. I'm an incest victim. I know how to make people like you feel good. So I've been doing that for a long time now. But whenever you tell me that bullshit about I shouldn't feel that way, I basically feel, what the hell am I doing with this guy? He doesn't get it. I'm deeply and fundamentally flawed. I say, good, thank you. So since that time, I have a policy to never charge my patients if I tell them anything that resembles, you shouldn't feel that way. Because that's what taxi drivers do, and shopkeepers do, and barkeepers, but that's not what therapists do. Huh? So what do you do instead? And so my first inkling again came through EMDR, and then I'll tell you something more. In the same group that Kathy is a member of, there's another woman who runs a halfway house for sexually abused girls. And surprise, surprise, she herself is also a sexually abused psychologist with a PhD. And one day she comes in and says, boy, this weekend I took an EMDR training and it's fantastic. And I roll my eyes and I think to myself, oh my God, another cult follower. And she says, can I talk about it? And I go like, well, it's up to the group. And so she tells me what happened to her during her EMDR session. And she says, I focused on the time that I was 7 years old when my father molested me. And I was doing this EMDR, and I saw this 7-year-old kid, this scrawny little thing, that's me. And there was this huge, gigantic, blubbery, whale, smelly, disgusting, hairy guy lying on top of me, shoving things into me. It's just disgusting. How can a big guy do that to a little girl like that? And again, that was the first time that I got to see that there's ways of helping people to be calmly in the present and to look at what happened to that little girl back then and to pull yourself apart from that and to start seeing what that little girl back there went to. I still do EMDR for that, but my main modality for that right now is internal family system therapy, where you help people to really separate out from those traumatized parts of themselves and to deal with it from a meditative state, basically. And so that's a big challenge of our field, is how to deal with this part of the brain, how to deal with this part of the brain. And then we have this part of the brain. That's, of course, the part that we like, and that's the engine of a conference like this. It's about talking, abstract thought, seeing what other people are feeling, sense of time, context, all the great civilized things. That also gets very damaged by trauma. And also, I don't think that most of the techniques that we use right now are able to undo the damage there. So let me just show you a few little things around that line. Do I go to 2:15?
Yeah, then we'll take a question.
Okay, so let me just give you, I want to show you two things that are relevant. One is a study done by a student of mine, Ruth Lanius, putting ordinary people in the scanner, in a brain scanner, and just letting them lie there, not doing anything. It's called the default state of the brain. What is your brain like when nobody is making any demands on you? And here's your brain. Front of your brain is your nose, brainstem, back of your brain. And so what lights up when you're just lying there by yourself, you think about yourself. And basically what you see here are the structures of the brain related to self, to you. And so there's the orbital prefrontal, anterior cingulate, medial prefrontal cortex. Oh, thank you. I hadn't seen that. These anterior structures give you a sense of self-awareness, give you your sense of this is what I like, this is who I am, this is what I want to do with my life, sense of direction, sense of purpose. There's all these frontal areas, very human. And then the back of your brain is this whole part of the brain that's involved in body awareness, body sensation. This is what my body feels, my body needs. I feel right now okay. I know that the sun is shining outside. My body really would like to go outside because it's one of the beautiful summer days, but I'm standing here firmly on a podium. I see you guys looking at me. I'm here, you're there, have a sense of position, relationship, context, all this sort of stuff. And that's me, you, all of us. Then she puts 18 chronically traumatized people in the scanner. And that's their self-experience. And when you see that, your life should never be the same again. It's one of these things like, you go like, holy shit. It's not about bad memories, it's not bad things that happen to you only. It's about yourself gets wiped out. Your feeling of who you are what you want to do, what your priorities are. No wonder that our traumatized patients ask us all the time for advice and never take it, because they don't know who they are and what to do. The back of the brain, the whole sensation of your body, also is largely disappeared. So what do you do about that? And how do you do that without having deep experiences of feeling yourself, noticing yourself? Don't even think about going to the trauma. As long as there's nobody home, somebody has to be home first. Somebody who says, this is me. This is who I am. This is what I stand for. And then when all of that is in place, you may, somewhere down the pike, go into, now let's process that terrible thing that happened to you a long time ago. But as long as you're not around, you just add more confusion to the pipe. Well, last thing. This is really my other main research these days. This study was done by the man I call my best friend, an Australian by the name of Alexander McFarlane. In psychiatry in this country, we sort of bought the chemical model and became horse to the pharmaceutical industry, but there were some people left in the world who actually thought there might be other ways in changing people, the way that people feel. And we also know that the brain is much more than chemicals, and it's also a pattern of electrical activities. And so what Sandy brilliantly does is he puts electrodes on the skulls of 38 normal Australians and plays a sound like eh. So the moment I make a sound like your brain has to figure out, is that his Dutch accent again, or is he in distress? Does he have a heart attack, or does he not know how to speak English? Whatever. You have to somehow interpret what that is. So it takes a little brain activity on your part. So here's what normal people, who are, I assume some of you, I don't believe in normal people, but so-called normal people, like they call them. So-called normal people, when they hear a sound like this is how they activate the brain. Every part of their brain collaborates with every other part of the brain to interpret what's going on here. So they're all working together. Traumatized people, the different parts of their brain are sort of off doing their own thing. That is very bad news, because the brain is not fully focused on figuring something out. And so what does a normal brain do? First thing it does, it generates an N200. I think you guys have generated a lot of N200. N200 is like, let's not pay attention to that sound over there, let's not pay attention to the chair against your butt, or the shoulder of your neighbor, or the perfume that's bothering you. Let's just pay attention to what this guy has, an inhibitory wave. And then what a normal brain does, it creates a wave called P300. That's the attentional wave that helps you to figure out what actually is. Just a stupid sound I'm making for illustration. When you're traumatized, you have a hell of a time filtering out irrelevant information. This wave basically doesn't occur. Everything is like everything else. My voice, your chair on your butt, the perfume of your neighbor, all that stuff is sort of living in a soup that has a hard time getting differentiated out. And you have a hell of a time when I make a sound like your brain has a hard time focusing on it and being there. This is a very big study. And when I first saw it, I thought, oh my God, we'll never be able to figure out how to deal with this. And that, this is, people are condemned to live with that, and they'll never get better. Let me see what I have next. Let me just end up with a positive note, if I have it here. Well, the EMDR tape was sort of positive, wasn't it? Like, if you can do that, it's pretty good. And so, that's my last thing. So, I sift those data, and then I meet this woman, Seaburn Fisher, and she says, do you know about neurofeedback? And I say, no, I don't really about neurofeedback. And she says, let me tell you about neurofeedback. You can play computer games with your own brain. You put electrodes in your brain, you project them on a screen, and you can see your brain working on the screen in your office, very cheap. And then you can play computer games with your own brain to change your brainwaves. I said, that sounds cool. I probably won't do it, but, and then she shows me this, and this is what gets me into it. So she's working with an 8-year-old boy, a severely traumatized boy, and that's his family portrait. This is a bad family portrait. You want to do better than that. And she does 20 sessions of neurofeedback with him, and that's his family portrait. And then she does another 20 sessions, and that's his family portrait. And I say to myself, I have never seen anything that in 3 months can change a person's brain and perception from that to that. So from time to time I look for interesting things to study, and this is about 6 years ago. And I've been studying, among other things, neurofeedback for the last 7 years. And we have some really kick-ass data. Too bad it's outside of the mainstream. So I've gone to NIMH 8 times to get funded. And every time they say, why should you do a study like that? We know the answer. It's cognitive behavioral treatment. Why should we fund anything like that? I say, because trauma is the biggest public health issue in our country. And unless we find the answers to this, we're fucked. Thank you. Okay.
Question?
Are there any studies helping us understand what happens to the brain in the case of dissociative identity disorder?
Yes, you asked the right guy. We did the first study on what happens in the brain dissociative identity disorder. Different parts of the brain get activated in different states. We did, that actually was our first neuroimaging study. Then Ellert Nijenhuis, of course, in this country, you know that the establishment doesn't believe in dissociative identity disorder, so there is no funding to study a non-existent disease. All we have to do is to tell our patients that they don't exist, okay? Because they don't exist. So in Europe, people study DID, namely Ellert Nijenhuis, and he just came up with another paper. Again, sort of showing how in different states, different brain activations are tied up. And I'm really good friends with Dick Schwartz and with the IFS crowd. I hope one of these days we'll do an IFS study to see how the different parts relate to each other in the brain. But these studies cost about $500,000. So it's a big challenge.
I wanted to go back to the slide that you showed just a few minutes ago where you were showing the effect of PTSD on the brain, and you said it's as if there's no identity, there's no one at home.
Right.
Could you speak a little bit more about that and how you work with that? And also, I was struck by that and something you said earlier about how there was no trauma from 9/11 because people were able to go home and be comforted. And is there some way in which we have to help people be at home? There was a parallel between what you were talking about there, I thought.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I hope I didn't exaggerate. Of course, there was trauma after 9/11. The people who lost their relatives. But overall, the pattern was very clear, is that people who had prior histories of abuse and neglect were sometimes had an increase in their PTSD symptoms. Coming home means you need to have a place to come home to, a place where your body is safe. And let me give an extreme example. There's a fair number of you do yoga, so yoga is a good paradigm. Yoga is about learning how to come home into your body, feeling safe in your home, which is where your body is. And most traumatized people don't feel safe in their bodies, and they have all these abnormal physiologies and sensations that are hard to work with, that do improve quite dramatically with yoga. Our first major scientific study on that is being published this month, actually. It's out now. And what we find is that when you deal with chronically traumatized people, you get to the state of Shavasana. Half of you know what Shavasana means. Shavasana is the final stage of yoga. You twist yourself in every pretzel, you work very hard, and in the final stage you lie on the floor and you just breathe very slowly and very deeply, and you have most of us have a very deep feeling of serenity, peace, calm, and connection with the universe. Our traumatized people during Shavasana have marked increased physiological arousal. They move their bodies, and so when they're lying still, their bodies don't feel safe. Maybe after a long time, we're now analyzing a much longer study to see if people over time acquire that. But what we found in our yoga study is both the parts of your brain that are involved in self-soothing and self-regulation and self-awareness do start to slowly come online, and but that inner sense of safety is very hard to acquire, but is the most important thing to achieve when you're a traumatized person. Okay. Yeah.
Just go back to the neuroimaging. There was one part of the brain which still lit up in the scans of patients with PTSD. Is that the cingulate?
No, that's the posterior cingulate.
That's the posterior
It
cingulate.
had very weak activation. These are all metaphors in a way. You manipulate your pictures in the way that things show up and don't show up. So it's all relative, decreases, increases. Doesn't mean there's nothing there, but it's all relative. So what stays to some degree online is your posterior cingulate, which is sort of the GPS of your body. It lets your body know where you are. But even that has markedly decreased activity. And so you don't have a very clear sense of where your body is. That's the sort of data that would propel me into paying more. Let me tell you a final South Africa story. Because I was an advisor to the committee, I had a chance to talk to some of the people on it. At some point, I was in a room with Mandela, and I asked him, so how do you understand how you became this quite angry revolutionary, which he was before he went to the island, Robben Island, and became this very serene person who was so aware of other people. And he said, I think it was boxing. And that boxing helped me to really see what other people's moves were about to be, and to very deeply be in touch with where I was, and to very quickly assess who I was in relationship to other people. And my first reaction was like, wow, that's crazy. And my second reaction as a neuroscientist was like, that makes total sense. Because the parts of your brain that you need in order to anticipate, to know where your body is, to know what you want to do, are exactly the sort of things that get activated by martial arts. And so if any of you have any trust funds lying around, how about funding a study of capoeira versus cognitive behavioral treatment for PTSD in adolescents? Be a very nice study to do. Tango dancing, I'll settle for tango. If you just happen to want to give me $1 million for tango dancing versus CBT, I'll take it. I'll do tango dancing. Because those coordinated, rhythmical engagements with other people is exactly what gets destroyed by trauma. Yeah.
I just want to say thank you for everything you've been saying. I use a lot of mindfulness-based work in my treatment of trauma, which has been very effective, but the thing that gets in the way is often addictions. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on treating addiction along with the trauma and what your research has shown, because that's the
question.
That's the easy one, but that's the part that seems to get in the way of even being able to do any other treatments is the addiction piece and keeping a person going.
God. Not only does it take 2 hours to answer that question, I also don't have the answer. So it's a bad combination. But one of the first papers I wrote about trauma is that people become addicted to their trauma. And that even though it feels miserable, it makes them feel alive. And so sometimes it becomes good to go back there. It's very important for therapists to know that telling trauma stories over and over again can sort of get you hooked there. The hardest thing is to change the attractors in your brain to find other things interesting. And that's again where the intense physical activities are very important for me. Very serendipitously, what happened when I started to do neurofeedback, I'll try to make this as brief as possible. when you do this work, you see a fair number of people who grow up and they dissociatively have, on the surface, very normal lives, and then have their reenactment patterns. Oftentimes, of sexual nature. I mean, 100 years ago in psychiatry, they would call it sexual perversions, and so quite a few sexual abuse people who I know lead normal lives, and then they hire people to do horrible things to them that's similar to what happened to them as kids. And it's an addictive pattern, clearly, because it's humiliating, terrible, but it also gives them a sense of addiction. And my very first neurofeedback patient, it was a person like that. I tried to treat him with everything I know, and I know a lot of little tricks, and nothing worked. And I started doing neurofeedback with him to calm his brain down, and he gave up his perverse stuff. I have no idea how it happened. And this happened to me now a number of times. In my new book, in my chapter on neurofeedback, I actually write about a whole bunch of very good research that was done in the early 90s on addiction with neurofeedback. And why it never found traction beats me, because those were really good data. And as far as I can judge the studies, I do that pretty well, those people did very well. So I don't know why that didn't gain traction. Okay.